Hi, I'm Reverend Paula Skiles with Unity Church of San Marcos. You know, Jesus hung out with some plain, ordinary folks, and that's actually what Son of Man really means. It's plain, ordinary folk. We know them as disciples, and many of them were fishermen. And Jesus liked to tell parables to make a point. I kind of like jokes. So let me tell you this story of this very inebriated fisherman. He decided to go fishing. And so he drilled a hole in the ice, looked down, and as he's peering, he hears this voice in the air says, "There's no fish down there." Oh, okay. So he stumbles over to another place and starts drilling his hole, and he looks down and he hears this voice again, louder, "There's no fish down there." So he stumbles about 50 yards away this time, drills another hole, and then he hears, "There's nothing here. There's no fish down there." And so looks up and he says, "Is that you, God?" And of course the voice says, "No, you ninny, it's the rink manager." So, "Nothing Here" is the title to this message. And it's about how you and I can experience a life beyond emptiness and experience blessings. So let me share this thought with you. You may not enjoy fishing, but perhaps you can relate to a time when you were looking for love in all the wrong places, or looking for your good in the wrong place. And it was because of the perspective you held or your attitude that you weren't able to find, or you weren't finding it because you were fishing in the wrong place. Like that of our inebriated fisherman. Now, his impairment was being inebriated. Hopefully that's not your impairment at the moment, but sometimes our impairments, if we take this joke up a notch, sometimes our impairments are our fears, or our ignorance, or even our stubbornness. One of my personal favorites. And so we might think that at times that our actions and our vision, so to speak, are impaired by these things. And we're looking at maybe with eyes of the past, or we're looking through the lens, if you will, of our own limitations. And we see nothing here can be done. But what can we do? Most of us, if you're like me, sometimes I feel like it's going to take a miracle in my life to deal with whatever's going on, and usually something big. So I like to think about the miracle of Jesus feeding and multiplying the loaves and fishes to feed the 5,000 men and women and children. And so let me share this Matthew's account of this story, because I think you're going to find that this is important for you today. Jesus had received some really harsh news, and he and the disciples had been spending a great amount of time in the area that he was in, healing people. And so he decided that it was time for them to go to a quiet place, a deserted place, so that they could just be alone for a bit. Well, wouldn't you know it, all the crowds decided to follow him on the boat. Him and all of his disciples on their boat decided to follow him along the shore to that deserted place. So they got there, and sure enough, there was the crowd. So in his compassion, Jesus and the disciples began once again, to heal people. And so now I realize there's probably nothing here if all we do is look at this miracle as a simple story of a miracle about something pertinent to our lives in today, other than a belief in something greater. So let me offer you a running narrative of this, an interpretation of this story that hopefully will make it more pertinent and be insightful for you in your life for today. So Matthew 14:15, we're told, when it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the day is now over. Send the crowds away to go into the villages so they can buy food for themselves." Now, there's a whole lot in this verse. First of all, we're talking about 5,000 men plus women and children. So this is a huge crowd. In other words, this is a large amount of people. And they all have needs. I mean, they have followed him from where he was to where he is now. And the disciples and Jesus are tired, I'm sure. You know, it's been a long day. On top of all the healings, they've just had this really difficult news about John the Baptist's execution and his death. And so they're having to deal not only with what's going on emotionally, but with all these problems as well, these people. So consider, if you will, Jesus is our spiritual awareness, our Christ consciousness. And the disciples are our own innate spiritual powers like faith, strength, imagination, will, understanding, wisdom. You get the idea, I think. And so they represent that. And can you see sometimes how these aspects of our being that are part of our Christ consciousness that make up that energy of Christ, can you see how sometimes they can get stretched and maxed out? I mean, we seem to need to use them all the time. And sometimes all these needs, these problems, and all the things that we have going on in our lives, they're just really big. And they just seem to, through the disciples, they just seem to overwhelm us. Maybe you can relate to that. And maybe this story will help you relate in a different way to what is needed. So, did you know that the whole world paused the other day? Why? Well, there was a mother who was getting ready for work. Her two oldest kids had already gone to school, and then she noticed as she walked by the bathroom, her littlest one, about 8 years old, he was standing there wiping his face. And she looked in and she said, "Are you okay?" And he looked up at her with tears just streaming down his face. And he just shook his head. No. And so she walked in and she asked him, she says, "Did something happen?" And again, tears just coming down. No. So she sat down on the edge of the tub and pulled him into her lap, and he just sort of cried into her chest for a few moments, as he laid his head there. And she told him, she says, sometimes our heart tanks feel empty, and we just don't have what we need to just face the next moment. And they need to be refilled. And she asked if she could hold him tight. He enjoyed that. He just still not crying, and he mumbled it. And so she said, "Can you feel my love filling you up?" And a few moments later, he's like, "Yeah." She said, "Okay. This is what's important. Can you feel it in your toes yet?" He said, "No, not yet." She said, "Okay." She says, "Work can wait. School can even wait. What's important is this, right here, right now. You getting filled up with love and what you need. And filling it up to the top is what she was about. And her son was like soaking it in, just taking it in. And after a moment she said, "Can you feel it now? You feel filled up?" And he looked up and his crying had stopped. He said, Yeah. So she held him a little longer. And then she looked in his face and looked into his eyes and she said, I can see it in there shining. I see you. And he was smiling. So, you may not be 8. You may not be 28, 38, 48, or 78. But each of us at times in our lives, our heart tanks, our souls, they're just empty. And we find ourselves feeling angry or snapping at others without any real reason or anything immediate. And we just cry and tears come and we just feel overwhelmed. And I want you to hear that that's the time to, that's the signal, that's what tells us that our heart tanks, our souls, are empty and need to be fed. They need to be nurtured. And it's no wonder that the disciples were snapping out and saying, just can't you send these people away? Just let them go off and let somebody else take care of it and solve it. Let them go get food for themselves. I just don't want to see them anymore right now. And it feels like when we're in this deserted place, this is a lonely place. It feels like desertion. It feels like emptiness. And there's nothing that can be done. And like the disciples, you just want it to go away. I know I've felt that way sometimes. You want someone else to solve it or fix it. And we want to just give up. Now this can be a metaphor for the really big things in our life. Maybe like you've got an emotional healing need that's ongoing, or you have a prosperity issue where maybe your bills are 50 times larger than your income. Maybe you're faced with a serious physical illness or a condition. Or your primary relationship is filled with more discord than harmony. Perhaps your children are getting into more trouble than you can handle and you don't know how to help them. And maybe even in the last 2 years you've been losing loved ones, a home, and the loss is just so overwhelming. Or even worse. There are worse things that can happen out there in life. I think Jesus knew that these kind of things are going to happen in our lives. And so when we have to face these things, these challenges, these burdens, and they threaten to overwhelm us, and we just cry out, just send them away. I just can't deal with it. Does he say, oh yeah, okay? No. Dang. I know, right? So they're not going to go away. They even followed him from where they were. So you know these are not going to go away. They're there. They've got to be dealt with. They have to be addressed. And Jesus said this, they need not go away. You give them something to eat. So the disciples are like, well, first of all, we have to recognize that the disciples within us, those inner strengths and powers that we have as part of our Christ awareness, are how we are meant to deal with these big issues in life. And they're meant to feed them, if you will. They're meant to take care of them. And Jesus is saying, you don't need the problem to go away. You need to do something with it and address it. So, now the disciples are not convinced. All right, they say, we have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish. So they're focusing on the problem, right? And what they don't have. And that's what seeing nothing here does for you and me. It limits us so that we see lack. Or when we have that nothing here, nothing's here. There's nothing in here. I have nothing left to give. Emptiness. Then it has to be addressed. And Jesus is saying the same thing. You have to do something to address this. I just wonder, with everything that's going on in our lives, maybe your heart and soul are on empty and you're feeling overwhelmed. If so, I'm hoping this message, as we continue, gives you something to fill that place. So Jesus said, 14:18, Matthew, "Bring them here to me." He's talking about the fish and the loaves. And taking the 5 loaves, then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass, and taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, now this is important, he looked up to heaven and blessed, and then he broke and gave the loaves to the disciples and the fishes, and the disciples began to give them to the crowds. All right, so metaphysically, in effect, this is referring to when you and I are at this point of discouragement in our lives, we are to take what we do have that feeds our spiritual awareness and that part of to our Christ consciousness. We're to take what we do have to our Christ consciousness. In other words, we're to take that energies of the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes, what they represent, to that part of us that's not bound by the conditions that are all around us, but is able to call into our lives that greater reality, looking up to heaven and receiving and knowing a blessing has been, and blessing that gratitude and thanksgiving are a part of that experience of blessing. And so he has said to the crowds, sit down. What he's saying is, you don't meet the problems on the level of the problem. You look up to heaven. You fill yourself up first with those energies of spirit like strength, power, will, wisdom, understanding, all the things you need that are only within you anyway. And then you can begin to break down the enormity of what it is. Having them sit down, break them down into groups, if you will, to where it's more manageable elements and pieces. So this is really key. Jesus took what they did have. He didn't discount those 5 loaves and 2 fishes. He focused on what was there and focused on the love that is still in the relationship, or the $5.20 that you do have, the little bit of self-esteem that you have, or the health you have. And then he looked up to heaven. He looked away from the facts only. He looked away from the problems, away from the needs, away from the lack, raised his vision to heaven. That consciousness that is raised up, that is lifted, and that you and I experience, where we find that sense of a greater reality. Again, love, truth, grace, all of these things, that greater reality, abundance, they are there and they flow into us, blessing us, and therefore blessing out, flowing out. And that's where the Christ blesses that which we have. He was able to feed these individuals. He gave it to the disciples. Now, these are actions that part of what you and I, steps that you and I take. We are needing to fill up in order to keep from being overwhelmed by the limiting facts or what we don't have. And instead of bemoaning that's all we have, or $5.20, or all I have is this little bit of health, instead of that, he fills his soul like you and I need to fill our souls. Like the little boy, he needed that love and to be able to fill his soul so that we can give thanks and open that avenue within our consciousness, within our minds and our beings, in which the good can flow. Because when we're focusing on there's nothing here, I have nothing here to deal with it, or I just want it to go away, we're closing down. we squeeze down on what comes into our life and into our thoughts and into our mind about how to do, how to live, how to express, or how to get through something. You know, you may have heard how plants grow and bloom really more profusely with praise and with love, and that they will wilt under criticism and condemnation. So the same thing is true for you and I. Fear and focus on on what isn't there has the ability to take that power that we have of expression and focus it on what we do not want. What Jesus is showing us is we take that power of expression and manifesting and focus it on what we do want. Here's a practical way to help fill that emptiness. It's not that we're not meant to acknowledge fear or frustration. I think many people really enjoy, maybe you do, writing down what we're upset about, moaning to God and getting it out and writing it out. But as we're doing something like that, as we're bemoaning all these conditions, don't forget that not only do we honor how it feels, how big it feels, but we also honor the possibility of how we can overcome it by writing up something positive as well. We validate truth in our being with maybe writing affirmations like, I now release my doubts and limitations to Christ's abundant grace and sail through life on the currents of divine order. Now, I'm going to repeat that because that's a fabulous affirmation. I now release my doubts and limitations to Christ's abundant grace and sail through life on the currents of divine order. He looked up to heaven. A metaphor for filling his mind, for you and I, filling our hearts and souls with Spirit's truth, grace, love, wisdom, power, all the things that whatever we might need, all the aspects of Spirit's being flowing to us and through us constantly, opening up that aperture so that they flow even more. The blessing. And in this way we give our creative power as he did, as Jesus did, to what we want to express. Now, Jesus started with what he had. He started small, you might say. And he didn't give up 5 minutes before the miracle. He began where he was. There are so many of us right now that are facing financial problems, and we forget about the power of gratitude and thanksgiving and tithing. And sometimes, if we don't practice what we know, we don't act on what we know. Our disciples of faith, strength, love, wisdom, understanding, imagination, and divine order, these are all meant to be how you and I feed our difficulties. The last part of this passage is a promise, and it goes like this. And they all ate and were satisfied, and they took up 12 baskets full of the broken pieces left over. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. Go out on a limb this week. Take a step on the water. Fill up your nothing here, your emptiness. Bless what you have, and then share from your abundance. God bless you. Thank you for being with me. I pray that this week is one in which your emptiness, your nothing here, is filled with the wonder of God and the miracle of your being.